So far in this video series, we have covered Revelation chapter 1 through 9, in 20 videos. Beginning with video 11, we have focused 9 of those 20 videos on Revelation chapter 9, because there is so much disinformation on this chapter, in popular culture. We have identified John's use of symbolisms from the text and his historical time frame. And you have seen what all the disinformation, spread by counter-reformationists, is actually designed to cover up. You have seen in verse 1, John echoes the Luciferian text found in Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12. And marks the rise of Luciferianism in Western civilization, with a Luciferian potentate, that would come to power in the Roman Empire, and would exalt his throne as equal to the throne of God in heaven. You saw how the text describes him receiving a key of authority from the well of the abyss, meaning the Roman place of the dead, in historical context, the Roman catacombs. You saw how John prophesied he would open up this place of the dead, and that smoke would arise out of it like a great furnace in verse 2. And you saw how the Antichrist would give authority to an army, compared to locusts, in verse 3, in the same way the army of the Roman Empire had authority, identified by their signature weapon, the scorpion. And we have seen that prophecies 1 through 9, of 24 prophecies, which are astronomically dated to the early Middle Ages, found in verses 1 through 12, have positively been fulfilled in history. And now we are ready to finish this section of Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 12, which describe the coming of the Antichrist, and his army, picking up with verse 4. Quote, "And he commands them not to do injustice to pastures of the land, nor to the vegetation, nor to the tree, unless not the men remaining, whoever, do not have the seal of God, upon the forehead of them." End quote. In video 13, you saw how this text was part of a series of opposites or contradictions that continue through all 11 verses in this section in John's description of the first army, under the authority of the Antichrist. In verse 4, he describes their contradictory or hypocritical nature, concerning how they will relate to people who belong to God. On the one hand, they will be told not to kill people who belong to God, or pillage and plunder their land, but on the other hand, that prohibition is compared to telling locusts not to eat any vegetation. The very people this army was raised up to destroy historically, are the ones they claim not to be targeting. In the same way, it would be commanding locusts not to eat any vegetation. It presents a complete contradiction, in its very nature. And we see prophecies 10 and 11 from our checklist fulfilled in the Vatican's prohibitions against plundering and pillaging, which went unfulfilled against the people of God, who were actually targeted by them, for plundering and pillaging, including the very family of Christ, who were eventually entirely exterminated because their farms were destroyed and they were denied the ability to buy and sell. In verse 5, John introduces another contradiction or hypocrisy, concerning this army, which is also covered, previously in detail, in video 13. Chapter 9 verse 5 reads as follows, quote, "And he grants to them that they not kill them but that they torture months 5, and the torture of them like torture of scorpion one strikes a man." End quote. Even though the KJV translates the Greek word as torment, the actual Greek word used there is basanidzo, and literally means torture. Prior to 9/11, whenever the word torture was brought up, most people almost inevitably associated with the term torture the Inquisitions. Historians have traced the use of torture, even in the modern era by criminal regimes and dictators, back to its origins in the Inquisitions. And here we see those very origins prophesied by John in Revelation chapter 9 verse 5, where the actual term, torture, is used. The scorpion referred to here is the Mediterranean variety known as the Androctona scorpion, which is Latin for man-killer. It is the most deadly variety of scorpion on earth, which causes a long and very painful slow death in its victims, without anti-venom medical intervention, which at that time in history, they did not have. So in the previous verse they are commanded to not pillage the people of God, which is compared to telling locusts not to eat anything green. And in the next verse in verse 5, John prophesies they will be commanded not to kill the people of God, but are given authority to torture them literally to death, in very slow painful deaths. So there is a clear statement of hypocrisy again, John is making, concerning their nature. Even though we have covered this text in detail in video 13, a few additional observations need to be made on it, here. The first notation that must be made on this text is that it was unmistakably fulfilled, historically, in the Inquisitions. And even today, Catholic apologists will defend the Vatican's use of torture, claiming it was to avoid killing people, even though historians have noted most victims of medieval torture would have died later from their massive injuries. Secondly, this text is repeated almost verbatim in verse 10, which most assume is simply a repetition. But as we pointed out earlier, it is repeated twice because there are two separate campaigns. Historically, in fact, there were two Inquisitions. The first was called the Episcopal Inquisition, which John would have been referring to here, and the second was known as the Papal Inquisition, which John would have been referring to in verse 10. Two references, and historically, there were officially two separate Inquisitions. The first being the Episcopal Inquisition referred to prophetically in verse 5, and the second being the Papal Inquisition referred to prophetically in verse 10. Thirdly, we need to look at the time conversion John provides in these two references. As mentioned earlier, John is using Jewish prophetic time conversion in his texts. This is the same way that the prophet Daniel used time frame material in the book of Daniel to prophesy the coming of Christ, which was accurate to the year and day of his prophecies. Time conversions seem complicated if you have never seen them before, but actually they are quite simple. You simply use the quantitative value presented in the text and convert the time cycle it creates to years. In multiple entries, all you do is sum all the values and multiply them times the number of repetitions. So for example, here in verse 5 and in verse 10 we are given 5 months. A month is 30 days, so 5 months would be 5 times 30, which equals 150. So to do a time conversion on these two texts, you would add 150 plus 150 together, to give you the sum, which would be 300, and then multiply it times 2 because of the two occurrences in the text, which would give you 600. Meaning 600 years. So John is not prophesying torture for 150 days by literal scorpions, unless you wish to argue Christ came literally 70 weeks or 490 days after Daniel, and that is what Daniel actually intended to say. John is prophesying two campaigns of torture. And if you interpret his time-framing method to be the same as used by Daniel, and as was customary in Hebrew prophecy, then you will end up with a prophecy of two campaigns of torture that will last for 600 years. If that is in fact how John is actually dating his textual references, then that is what we should see historically. The Inquisitions could randomly occur any number of years, from a single decade to a millennium. So that is a lot of possibilities. In fact, if we actually convert the number of possibilities that could have occurred from 10 years to 1,000 years, we would literally have 990 possibilities. And in contrast we have only one time frame, from John using Hebrew time conversion. So the odds that John would be right would only be 1 out of 990 odds, or a 0.001% chance. If the meteorologists on your local weather channel told you there was a 0.001% chance of rain, would you take an umbrella to work that day? Probably not. And those are the odds that John's prophetic time frame concerning these two campaigns of torture would be correct. Yet, despite these odds, when we look at these two Inquisitions in history, according to secular historians, that is precisely how long. Many secular historians report that the Inquisitions actually lasted 600 years. Secular historians constantly debate everything. That is one of the things common to a professional study of history, but those who vary from the time frame of 600 years do so on the higher side of that estimate, not the lower. It is very hard to find a single historian that will argue the Inquisitions were less than 600 years. 600 years, in many cases to the year, and that is the low side that most secular historians will attribute to the Inquisitions. And there is a 1 out of 990 odds that those two figures would randomly match, as they do. And this is the kind of dramatic precision and accuracy counter-reformationists have to ignore, dismiss and hide, in order to claim these prophecies have not happened yet, in history. Of course, that doesn't bother counter-reformationists in the least, because as noted earlier, the goal of the theology is not the truth, It is simply propaganda over the truth, no matter what the truth is, or the theological and historical consequences for suppressing or hiding it. So we see that prophecies 12, 13 and 14 on our checklist were fulfilled in history, in the rise of the Inquisitions. Next in verse 6, we read the famously quoted text that is interpreted to mean that locust scorpion bugs from a bottomless pit turn people into zombies, incapable of dying, just so they could be tortured longer. When in fact, as you saw previously in video 13, it reads in the Greek quite different, and says that in those days men would worship death, and not perceive it, and would desire to die, and death would run, or flee, or shun them. And as explained in video 13, this was a reference to the veneration or worship of death on the one hand, and at the same time, the criminalization of suicide on the other. Thus posing another very strange contradiction. The cultural influence of Roman Catholicism's veneration of necromancy or worship of death is still seen today in its instruction to keep dead body parts under their Eucharist altars, in the Roman Missal, and in holy days such as Halloween, or All Saints' Eve, and Mexico's Day of the Dead. If you have ever wondered why a supposedly Christian country would dress up as rotting dead people and devils on October 31st, you need look no further than the Roman Catholic Church for the origin of those demonic practices. As precisely stated prophetically about what was to come in Revelation verse 6, under the rule of the Antichrist. Those who wish to argue the Antichrist has not come are left with no explanation for these immensely contradictory things in current Western civilization, such as Luciferianism, Halloween, the Day of the Dead, and even Christmas. In verse 7, John clarifies his use of locust symbolism by stating it as a reference to cavalry. And he makes the observation that the cavalry will wear something similar to crowns of gold, or king's crowns, on their head. During this time in history, some changes came to the way the Roman helmet was constructed. In the past, the Roman helmet looked like this. It was heavier and bulkier, and its flaps often got in the way during battle. It was also more expensive to make. Under the new Byzantine Roman Empire, the new helmet's design became known as the Spangelheim helmet. What was striking about the new style helmet was that it was constructed in a shape that was identical to the king's crown of that era. The early Spangelheim helmet was often made from bronze, which has a gold color to it. The introduction of the bronze Spangelheim helmet to the Byzantium army was a fulfillment of the prophecy in verse number 7. So we see prophecies number 17 and 18 on our checklist, fulfilled in history, in the rise of metal-plated, barded horses, and bronze Spangelheim helmets. In verse 8, John notes that they also had hair like women. When you go to research this development, especially from Counter-Reformation or Catholic sources, they will very proudly or dogmatically claim Roman soldiers wore short hair. And that was true, up until an obsessive compulsion over Apollo as Christ developed culturally. Apollo wore hair like a woman, or in other words, had distinctively long hair. And what these sources do not explain is that shortly after this period, John's prophecy about this trend to wear hair as a woman came to pass. Because it was natural to want to emulate the image they were given of Christ as having long hair. In fact, so much so, that while you will hear the denials and explanations about short hair, you will also find archaeology and illustrations of knights in long hair, and even the founding dynasty of kings known as the Merovingian kings of the Holy Roman Empire, were actually known by the Latin phrase, regus crinti, which literally in Latin means, the long hair. This prophecy was fulfilled in the rise of the founding kings of the Holy Roman Empire, as the long hairs. And in verse 8 John mentions also something he describes as having teeth like lions. One of the developments that came along with the rise of the new Spangelheim helmet was the invention of the infantry face mask to protect the face in close combat. The Spangelheim battle mask was designed to intimidate the opponent and included, guess what? If you guessed teeth like lions, then you would be correct. So we see verse 8 was fulfilled in history in the rise of the founding kings of the Holy Roman Empire, known as the regus crinti, or long hairs, and in the development of the Spangelheim battle mask, which included teeth like lions. And And so we see prophecies 19 and 20 on our checklist, fulfilled in history with the development of the battle mask and the rise of the long-haired kings. In verse 9, as you saw in video 14, John describes the coming of plate armor, beginning with the rise of Lorica Segmentata, shown with Constantine on Constantine's victory arch. And in verse 9 also as described in video 14, the use of barded horses, which created a feather-like appearance on the horse, and were very noisy when running into battle, which John makes an unmistakable note of. So we see verse 9 fulfilled in history with the introduction of plate armor and barded horses. And once again, we see the fulfillment of prophecies 21 and 22 on our checklist, in the rise of metal-plated armor made of iron, and feathered horse barding. In verse 10, as mentioned earlier, we read about the Second Inquisition, known as the Papal Inquisition, which we covered earlier. And we see number 23, once again, on our checklist of prophecies, fulfilled in history. And in verse 11, as you saw earlier in videos 15 and 16, John wraps up this section with his final observation about what deity this army is in reality serving, and he points his finger at the Greco-Roman sun deity, born on December 25th, Apollo, as their true deity and as a king which is ruling over them. This reference, once again, dates this text historically to the events which began in 312 AD with the rise of Constantine and the Roman papacy. This text was fulfilled in history literally, once again, when Constantine placed a statue of Apollo outside the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, with his own face on the statue, and his reading of Virgil's fourth eclogue, which ends with a reference to Apollo's reign at its public dedication. John's prophecy that they would have Apollo as their king was very literally fulfilled in history, in those events. And we see the last prophecy, number 24, on our checklist of prophecies, fulfilled in history. So now, you can see all 24 prophecies listed by John in Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 11 have actually occurred, and have been clearly fulfilled, in history. And finally, after all these things, we come to the close of the first section, when John pronounces the fifth trumpet will have now passed. And that is precisely what has happened in history. And we see in the clarification of these texts from the underlying Greek manuscripts, and in the subsequent events which occurred in history, the fifth trumpet has been fulfilled, and is declared past by John in his text.
And the fifth messenger sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the Lamb. And to him was given the key of the well of the abyss. And he opened the well of the abyss. And there arose a smoke out of the well, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the well. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the land. And unto them was given authority, as the ones having scorpions of the land have authority. Commanded that they should not damage the grass of the land, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given, that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion, when he strikes a man. And in those days men shall worship death, and perceive it not, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the shapes of the locusts were like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men. They had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. They had armor, as it were armor of iron, and the sound of their feathers was as the sound of multi-horsed chariots running to battle. They had tails like scorpions, and they pierced with their tails, and their power was to torture men 5 months. They had a king over them, which is the messenger of the well of the abyss, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue he has the name Apollo. One woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. Revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped.
As you saw previously, the Counter-Reformation interprets Chapter 9 to be speaking about a bottomless pit, out of which come magic hybrid locust scorpion bugs, that torment the whole earth, and create living dead which are incapable of death. And as you also saw previously, none of which is actually in the Greek text. The text never refers to the whole earth, it describes the locusts as a cavalry mounted by men. Scorpions are mentioned simply in the comparative sense, and that reference actually refers to the military weapon of the Roman army. And if that were not enough already, the text is actually astronomically dated to 312 AD, which the Counter-Reformation already fully knows, but works incessantly and dishonestly to keep intentionally hidden from the public. And as you saw earlier, the first prophecy is actually a prophecy about the rise of the Antichrist in Rome, and the coming of the army of the Antichrist, which is described as having iron-plated armor, barred horses, infantry masks, and adopting Apollonean hairstyles after the manner of Apollo. This army is also described as conducting 2 campaigns of torture under the hypocritical claim of not killing. This army is described as being filled with hypocritical contradictions concerning its military decrees and policies, such as its attitudes concerning pillaging and plunder, and life and death. And it will have Apollo as their king, the Greco-Roman sun god deity, born on December 25th. All of which have occurred historically. Now we come to the prophecy concerning the second army. This army is raised up to bring destruction on the army of the Antichrist. This army is described as being even more terrible than the first army. And the terrible nature of the second army will be intentionally raised up to bring a divinely inspired destruction on the first army. John's prophecy concerning the second army begins in verse 13 and is transliterated as follows, quote, "And the 6th messenger trumpeted, and I heard sound, one out of the 4 horns of the altar, of the gold of the presence of the God." End quote. As you saw in video 11, the astronomical event John describes in verse 13 was a double meteor shower in the constellation Era Scorpio, and is astronomically dated with certainty in ancient records to the year 824 AD. John continues in verse 14, quote, "Saying to the 6th messenger who holds the trumpet, loose the 4 messengers which are bound at the river the great Euphrates." End quote. As you saw in video 17, the text says nothing about demons, nor is this a reference to anything in the river. The phrase bound at the river Euphrates means by, upon, or at, not inside of, as is often misquoted. And the text is a clear prophecy about a 4-part, geopolitical entity, which would be bordered by the Euphrates River. which as you know by now from video 17, there actually was, and which fits precisely in John's astronomically dated time frame for this prophecy. John now gives another prophetic time frame, in verse 15, which reads as follows in our transliterated text. Quote, "And released the 4 messengers prepared for the hour and day and month and year to kill the Triton of the men." End quote. As noted in video 17 as well, the expression hour, day, month and year convert out to be 106 days past, 396 years. Which must be added to John's astronomically dated reference in verse 13, beginning at the year 824 AD. If you add 396 years to the year 824 AD, it will bring you to the year 1220 AD. And once again, to the very year, we see in history, the Mongolians breached the Euphrates River and began their western invasion of the Middle East and Europe. To the year. Their empire was a 4-part empire ruled by 4 khans, and precisely as is described in Revelation chapter 9, their empire was bordered by the Euphrates River. And as you also saw in video 11, the phrase, quote, "the Triton of men," was a reference to the Roman Triad, also referred to as the Triton, because the Triad itself in Roman theology had originated with the archdeity, Triton. So the prophecy was that it would bring destruction on the Triton of men, not a third part of all men on the earth. There is no reference to the whole earth anywhere in the language in the Greek text. The word is simply the land. However, this army did in fact extract massive casualties on the Byzantine army of the Holy Roman Empire, eventually reducing it to pages of history. John continues in verse 16 as follows, quote, "And the number of troops of the cavalry, 2 myriads of myriads, and I heard the number of them." End quote. As was covered in video 17, myriads of myriads was a Greek idiomatic expression, meaning countless and innumerable many, and of no specific quantity other than unimaginably large. And in fact, you can't read the text any other way even if you wanted to, because the numbers are so large if taken literally, they are virtually logistically impossible for a ground invasion force, much less a cavalry, which is what the text actually says. Because the entire Earth itself does not have enough horses on the entire planet for that scenario to occur. And even if you just ignore the text and arbitrarily take it as a reference to ground infantry, it still becomes an unfeasible and logistically impossible feat if nothing else, simply because of the physical land space required by 200 million infantry side by side. If each soldier takes up only 5 feet of surface space, the resulting land mass required by 200 million soldiers would stretch for 186,000 miles, or literally around the Earth, several times. The surface land space of the soldiers themselves would be larger than the Middle East itself, much less the river Euphrates, which they would physically outdistance by thousands of miles. But as a numeric hyperbolic expression, it was precisely how the invasion force of the Mongolians was described by ancient historians. In the next verses, John gets so specific about this invasion force that the Counter-Reformation realized the only way to dispose of this reference to the papacy was to simply bury the content of these texts from the public. He describes their massive invasion force, their military color guard, and even details about their weaponry. And once again, as you saw in video 17, these descriptions have specifically nothing to do with atomic bombs, but everything to do with the introduction of gunpowder, which as the text actually spells out in Greek, was made from sulfur. In verse 17 John states, quote, "And in this way I saw the horses in the vision, and those sitting on them, having armament of fire and jacinth, and sulphurous, and the heads of the horses like heads of lions, and out of the mouth of them discharged fire and smoke and sulphur." End quote. Here is a picture of the Mongolian color guard, dressed as Mongolians did in the invasion of 1220 AD. As you can clearly see, John's description was completely accurate. They dressed in flaming red and blue and yellow. They introduced the use of gunpowder, made from sulfur precisely as described, into the battlefields of Europe, which they shot from their mouths, and decimated European knights, armed in plate armor made from iron, shooting Roman scorpion bows. In verse 18, John states, quote, "By these 3 things were killed the Triton of men, out of the fire, and out of the smoke, and out of the sulfur, of the discharging out of the mouths of them." End quote. If you notice in the text, John matches the three things of destruction, the fire, and smoke, and sulfur, with the triton of men, which it kills. In verse 19, John writes, quote, "The reason power of them is in the mouth of them, and is also in the tails of them, is because the tails of them are like snakes having heads, and in these they harm." End quote. In verse 19, John mentions something that makes his reference to gunpowder absolutely unmistakable. As you saw in video 17, his use of the word sulfurous in the text was completely clear, even to the Counter-Reformation, and that is why they went to extraordinary lengths to hide and obfuscate the reference. So what John has described already in the previous 3 verses was already clear, without what he adds in verse 19. Because of time restraints in video 17, verse 19 was not mentioned in video 17. But what John says in verse 19, makes his reference to gunpowder in verses 17 and 18, all that more unavoidable. He describes something, looking like snake heads, that causes the discharge of the sulfur to explode. Obviously atomic bombs are not made from sulfur, as is gunpowder, nor are they shot from the mouth, as is gunpowder, nor are they shot while riding on horses, as is gunpowder, and there certainly is nothing in John's description, in verse 19, that even remotely relates to atomic bombs. Not even in the most stretched imaginations. This is simply a text that is completely ignored, or excused, by counter-reformationist preachers, because they have no explanation for it. John introduces a description that obviously has no relation to atomic bombs. But there is something intimately connected to the development of gunpowder that looked exactly like what John describes, and that is his reference to the heads of snakes. And here is what it is. This little piece of metal, which looks exactly like a snake's head, raised up to strike, was the introduction of the flint mechanism that fired the earliest rifles on the battlefield. And once again, it is an unmistakable reference to the introduction of gunpowder weaponry that rendered the Roman scorpion bow completely obsolete. And John ends chapter 9 and his prophecy of the decimation of the army of the Antichrist by the use of this new weaponry by an army from the east across the Euphrates, with the limit that despite all these coming disasters and woes, the people of the Roman Empire would not repent of their idolatry and worship of devils, nor of their murder, sorcery, fornication, and theft. Which he states in verse 20. Quote, "And the remaining men, those not killed in the plagues, they did not reform out of the works of the hands of them, so that they not worship the demons, and idolatry of gold and of silver and of stone and of wood, which neither seeing ability have, nor hear, nor walk." End quote. In verse 21, John continues his lament, quote, "And not reform out of murderings of them, nor out of the sorcery of them, nor out of the immorality of them, nor out of the thieveries of them." End quote. And that concludes John's prophecy concerning the 2 armies, in Revelation chapter 9. As you have seen, this text has nothing to do with the end of the world, bottomless pits, hybrid locust scorpion magic bugs, zombies, or Armageddon. What it does have to do with, is why we worship a deity born on December 25th, who has long blonde hair and blue eyes, whom we call Christ, despite the fact it isn't, and we know he was not born then. What we see on December 25th is the historical fossil of the coming of the Antichrist in 312 AD, and the worship of Apollyon, precisely as John prophesied in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11.
And the 6th messenger trumpeted, and I heard a voice out of the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God. four messengers which are bound at the great river Euphrates. by these plagues, reformed not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone, and of wood, which neither can see nor hear, nor walk. Neither reform they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts.
The phrase, common horse sense, was an American idiomatic expression that peaked in the 1940s. According to some sources, it referred to the fact that horses often knew their way home, even when the riders didn't. For example, a drunk could get on his horse, and the horse would be able to find his way home without instructions from the rider. And so, it became a euphemism for basic common sense. The Counter-Reformation claims Revelation chapter 9 is all about bottomless pits, magical bugs, the end of the world, Armageddon, the living undead, atomic bombs, and countless variations of imaginative descriptions which come more from ink-blot-free associations than textual readings. When we get to Revelation chapter 9, it can be said that Counter-Reformation theology is lacking some basic common horse sense, and this expression is true in more ways than one. You have seen that John has two prophecies in Revelation chapter 9. And both of these prophecies focus on descriptions of mounted cavalries, or in other words, horses. In the first prophecy, concerning the first army, he describes the cavalry as looking like locusts, which is a clear reference to armor-plated, barded horses. And he clarifies that he is describing a cavalry in verse 7. Concerning the first army, John also states that the men have hair like women and teeth like lions, and as you saw previously, that was a clear reference to the Regus Crinti, known as the long hairs, of the Holy Roman Empire, and the infantry battle mask, which actually did have metal teeth on the face mask. In the second prophecy, concerning the second army, he states that the horses of the second army look like lions, and doesn't specify any further, implying the readers would understand the reference. The most notable thing about the lion, as an animal, and which goes without saying, is its mane, which is very pronounced when you look at a lion, visually. So the question would naturally arise, in the mind of any honest person, not trying to contort these texts into descriptions of magic bugs from bottomless pits, why is John pointing out to his readers that these horses, of the second army, John is prophesying about, have a very unusual mane? And which is clearly distinct from the horses of the first army. What's the big deal with the manes of these horses, and what difference does it make? And here in this question, is the final nail in the coffin, for the Counter-Reformation's premillennial rapture theology. When it comes to Revelation chapter 9, metal-plated armor and mounted cavalries obviously do not refer to the future, or the end of the world. They refer to something in history. And you have seen how the rise of Lorica segmentata armor and barded horses match these descriptions perfectly, and they also match perfectly John's astronomically dated time frame. You couldn't just arbitrarily get the astronomical event to actually be exactly and specifically 396 years prior. You couldn't get the Mongolian state of breaching the Euphrates to be exactly 1220 AD. You couldn't just accidentally have an empire ruled by 4 khans, and bordered by the Euphrates at this exact same time in history, at this exact same location in the east, at this exact same place. And when it comes to John's observation concerning the horses of the Second Army, having distinctive manes, once again there is such precision and detail in that reference, it simply could not be an accident of imagination. It is historically precise in such a manner that it places John's reference beyond random chance. If you were just making things up, you could not get the precise date of these events to match actually the descriptions, the way they do. And when it comes to the distinction John notes concerning the mane of the horses of the Second Army, we see another, unmistakably precise, detail. Why is that? There are many species of horses in the world today, although the population of horses has actually steadily declined for centuries, and will continue to do so, as societies around the world, and their modes of transportation, continue to become modernized. But many of the species of horses we have today, have been bred by modern breeders, attempting to accentuate one quality over another, more for aesthetic and competitive reasons, than for labor, transportation and utility, as in the past. Today there are many breeds with distinctive manes, such as the Andalusian, the Haflinger, the Icelandic, and the Black Forest. And while some breeds, such as the Andalusian, have lineages that can be traced back into history, most of these horse breeds have been bred since the 1800s. And historically concerning the text in Revelation 9, we know we are looking at the standard military horse of a medieval cavalry. And here is where things get very interesting. In Europe, there were 3 types of horses used for military purposes. One for hauling equipment and supplies, one for elite generals, and one for general use by the cavalry. The horse in common use by the Greco-Roman Empire, and which continued to be used well into the Middle Ages, and into the Byzantium Empire, is shown here. It is also the same kind of horse, seen on the Greek vase, to the right. As you can see, this kind of horse has a short mane. Another horse common to the Middle Ages was the Arabian horse. It is pictured here. On the left is a photo of an Arabian horse, and to the right is how it is depicted in art. Arabian horses have a medium mane, similar to a common horse mane of most breeds today. Arabian horses were introduced to Europeans by the Moors, and were interbred with European lines, to create many of the new breeds we have today. Arabian and European horses were commonly bred, in many areas, in the medieval world. But there was another horse, that made its way onto the equestrian landscape, of medieval Europe. It was an unusual horse and bred entirely in Mongolia. It was smaller than the Arabian horse, and European horses, for one, so it never came into use by Europeans, whose use of plate armor, required larger horses. But it was a fast horse, and extremely hardy. And there was another distinctive feature of the Mongolian horse. It grew an extremely long mane, especially as compared to the European horse and the Arabian horse. And it was this breed of horse that historians credit Genghis Khan's success in conquering the world. The Mongolian Empire was the largest empire in the world in recorded history up to its time. It covered over 9 million square miles, or just over 16% of the Earth's land surface. It has only been exceeded since, by the British Empire, at the pinnacle of its expanse, in the 1920s. Mongolian culture was completely centered around their horses. The skill and horsemanship of the Mongolian rider was and still is even today, unparalleled in the world. Mongolian children learned to both ride and compete before many children in the rest of the world even attend their first elementary school grade. And right in the text in Revelation chapter 9, discussing the future conquerors from across the Euphrates, from the east, John makes the unique observation from his vision that he sees horses that have an extremely unusual appearance. They have very thick manes, which he compares to that of lions. And that very characteristic was a specific detail that was not true about the European horse, nor the Arabian horse. It was a definitive specific characteristic about the Mongolian horse, which was used by the Mongolian cavalry. The same Mongolian cavalry that swarmed their opponents with overwhelming numbers, inspiring the later military strategy developed by the Germans, known as the Blitzkrieg. The same Mongolian cavalry, ancient historians recorded their numbers being countless. The same Mongolian cavalry that breached the Euphrates River in 1220 AD, precisely 396 years after the sign of the globally seen double meteor shower in Era Scorpio. And there is no way all of this could possibly be simply a random coincidence, with such amazing detail, down to such minute precision, as even a reference to the distinctive thick manes on the horses they actually rode into battle, centuries before these events ever occurred in history. And it is precisely this historical precision, including down to the very last detail of the mane on the horse itself, that drives a nail into the coffin of the Counter-Reformation's ridiculous magic bug interpretation of Revelation chapter 9. The Mongolian invasion of Europe, and the Mongolian horse that brought it, are specifically mentioned in Revelation 9, down to the very detail of even the horse's mane. And this is why the Counter-Reformation is missing some basic horse sense in its interpretation of Revelation chapter 9. The historical interpretation of Revelation 9 is proven as factual with nothing more than just basic horse sense. And by that we mean, even the detail of the Mongolian horse's mane. In 1651, a religious sect of crazy people arose in England. They were called Muggletonians after their founder, Lodowick Muggleton, who imagined himself to be one of the two witnesses mentioned in Revelation chapter 11. He subsequently went around London, pronouncing empty curses on people, based on nothing more than his personal vanity. Sir Walter Scott had been one of his targets, who apparently failed to fall over dead, as a result of Muggleton's curse. More about the Muggletons in just a moment. In this video, we have concluded Revelation chapter 9. And you have seen how the Counter-Reformation is intentionally hiding information from the public concerning what is really in this text. You have seen how verses 1 through 12 prophesy the coming of a Luciferian potentate in Rome. How he is given a key of authority from the Roman place of the dead, in historical context, the Roman catacombs. You have seen how John mentions the Roman scorpion bow, the barded cavalry, the infantry battle masks, the Regius Crinti long hairs, and the column of Constantine as Apollo. You have also seen that in the second prophecy, John cites the rise of the Mongolian Empire, using astronomical dating, their breach of the Euphrates River in 1220 AD, their introduction of gunpowder made from sulfur, their flintlock firing mechanism, acquired from Persia, and the Mongolian horse they rode upon. And you have seen how the Greek text says nothing about the whole earth, bottomless pits, zombies incapable of death, or Armageddon. In the next video, we will begin our examination of Revelation chapter 10 and 11, and the Counter-Reformation's claim that there will be two witnesses in Jerusalem, that will prophesy, during their fictitious 7-year tribulation period, after the fictitious rapture, of all Christians on the entire planet, and after 2/3 of it has already been completely destroyed. And thus giving rise to a modern version of the Muggletons all over the world today. Every year, Israeli police actually have to arrest tourists in Israel who imagine the end of the world is at hand, and that they have been sent by God to stand in the streets of downtown Jerusalem and scream curses at pedestrians, as one or both of the Counter-Reformation's end-time last day two witnesses. Unfortunately for most of these victims of Counter-Reformation theology, they have no idea how misled and delusional they have become, because Revelation chapter 10 and 11 is a prophecy about a book, which has two testimonies. Not two literal people. As you will see, the Counter-Reformation's interpretation of Revelation 10 and 11 is just as bad as their explanations of Revelation chapter 9. Even though they spend much less time and effort on hiding its actual contents from the public, they still manage to victimize just as many people with their twists and dodges on chapter 10 and 11, as they have with chapter 9. And we will clear away these profoundly sad obfuscations and distortions, starting with the next video. You will be amazed at what the Counter-Reformation has hidden from the public, once again. Don't miss the amazing truths the Counter-Reformation has been hiding from you, in Revelation chapter 10 and 11, which we will begin to examine in the very next video. Thank you for watching.